Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. My name is Anne Marie Aikins, and I've been public relations, crisis management, and media expert for longer than I like to admit. It's been a big chunk of my career. I've worked with large public sector organizations like Toronto Public Library and more recently Metrolinx. I joined here in Curious Public after I left Metrolinx in January of this year, and I'm now an executive consultant to our clients in need of media relations or PR or crisis communications and emergency management support. So that's what I've been doing here. And that's why we decided to talk about, this is a way to end the year, was to talk about crisis communication, and hence why I'm your host. But I would be remiss if I didn't talk about what the day means to me today. It's December 6th, and it was a long time ago now, but in 1989, there was a murder of 14 young women in Montreal, and they were just because they were women. I will never forget that day. I was working in a rape crisis center. And it was the first story itself, because I was executive director of this rape crisis center. The first story I had to manage because I was in a small community, and that's where media, they were trying to tell the story, and they would fortunately tell it through women's eyes, but trying to cope with the shock and the grieving. And I was bloody angry. That was a challenge. So it was my introduction to really working with media and in crisis communications. That was the beginning. So I am joined here today with some expert panelists. My first panelist I will talk about is Colin, who we wondered if Colin would even be able to be here. Colin D'Mello. He is probably very familiar to you. You may have seen him at Queen's Park today on CP24. I was watching you, Colin. He's been many years as one of Ontario's most prominent political journalists, and he is currently the Queen's Park bureau chief for Global News. But he's built us a strong following and a strong career reporting for other notable channels as well. So welcome, Colin.
Thank you so much for having me, Anne Marie.
Yeah, and thank you for, that must have been tricky getting here, so thank you. And my next guest panelist is Charles Finlay. He's the founder of Rogers Cybersecure Catalyst. It's our nation's leading hub for cybersecurity, innovation, and collaboration. Charles is a communication expert, a former journalist as well, and a thought leader in cybersecurity and Canada's role in cyber defense. Thanks so much for being here as well, Charles.
Great to be here, Anne Marie. Thank you.
And our third panelist today is Logan Ross. Logan Ross is a senior vice president of communications and campaigns for Counsel Public Affairs. Counsel is one of Canada's most respected government relations firm, and they just happen to be one of our partner agencies here at Curious Public. Logan is a strategic communications expert and known for being the calm in the storm when managing crises and communicating through them. So welcome, Logan. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, we're going to go right into it because it's a chock full of information the next hour. So I want to talk about it. There have been huge stories in 2023. I mean, huge. It was hard to narrow down. We had meeting after meeting narrowed down because there's been many military conflicts. We're in the midst of several right now. That story is still unfolding. So we thought the story that is one that is kind of more resonating here at home, and there's so many chapters involved in it, and I don't think we've come to the end of this book yet. But the first topic is the Green Belt. So the Ontario Green Belt is one that just, as I said, keeps unfolding. Colin, you've been at the kind of covering this story extensively for Global News, like really extensively, uncovering pieces after pieces in a variety of ways. So first, can you speak to why this story is staying so securely in the public domain and isn't going away? Why do people give two hoots about it? And second, in your opinion, has the province's communications helped or hindered the story in any way? And what could they have done from a communications point of view? How can we learn from this story?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting story because, at the outset, a lot of people you wouldn't think would be that interested in the Greenbelt. I mean, you think about the vast majority of people who live in this province, right? How many times do you actually interact with the Greenbelt? You might see the signs along the highway, but not really know enough to be able to navigate it or pick it out in a map. And I always make the argument that, from a communications perspective, if you're thinking about the average individual Ontarian, right? I use my mom as a barometer all the time. She lives in Scarborough, goes to work, comes home every day, is thinking about the price of groceries, the price maybe of gasoline, the price of, transit and other things, and cooking for her favorite son, of course. If you think about all those things, the Greenbelt doesn't really intersect with her daily life. So why would someone like that actually care? And so that's why it's been very interesting that people have given a lot of or shown a lot of interest in the Greenbelt. I think what it boils down to is just the idea of government corruption, right? Or just the question of government corruption. Using my mom as an example, or she might be thinking as she, has to no longer take the Scarborough RT, which she used to before, and now has to take a bus to get home every day. She's thinking, well, what is the government doing for me? And then she sees that these developers are, perhaps getting preferential treatment according to the Auditor General, and could be having some kind of an insider track with the government. And I think that's what causes people to feel a bit upset about it. There's also been sustained coverage, right? And we've seen the Premier kind of react in different ways, not necessarily all in the most dignified of ways that you would expect the Premier to react. And so I think that's one of the reasons why people are quite interested in it, because it seems like there are twists and turns. It seems like there's people who have the Premier's ear, have an inside track with the government that they don't necessarily get. And then to a degree, it's something they can understand, right? Everyone's been talking about building homes. And here you have a few developers seeming to benefit off of the idea of building homes, and homes are not really cheaper. In terms of the government's communications, Anne Marie, and what they could have done or could not have done differently, my argument here is that what the government did in opening up lands for the Greenbelt could have been defensible. The way they chose to do it was the indefensible part, right? So if you take, for instance, the Cherrywood developments in Pickering, they were supposed to build some 30,000 homes there. And I spoke to the mayor of Pickering, who said that they were going to get $800 million in community benefits, things like new schools, fire halls, community centers, libraries, etc., that the developer was going to pay for. We never heard anything about this from the government, right? So if the government had spent maybe about 6 months or a year or 3 months or whatever, trying to kind of fertilize the land, right? Trying to say to people at home, look, we're in the middle of a housing crisis. Here's a development that could give us 30,000 homes and a heck of a lot of community benefits that you, the taxpayer, don't have to pay for. Most people would say, oh, that sounds like a pretty good deal. But the government didn't do any of that pre-positioning work. And as a result, found itself moving way too quickly, raised a lot of suspicion and questions, and has now landed itself in an RCMP investigation. And as a result, all the work that it has done is now being reversed, leading to the question of whether we are 1 year behind in building homes to make things more affordable. So I think pre-positioning, right, laying some of the groundwork, fertilizing the land before you harvest it is the most important thing. As somebody in this space told me, you gotta lay the tracks before you drive the train. And I think that applies here. They didn't lay the tracks.
Yeah, they were using fertilizer, but it's a different kind of thing.
Yes, horse
Speaking
fertilizer.
of that, so Logan, it's such great points, Colin, and it leads right into what I'd like to ask Logan, because you work in crisis communications, and how do you go about prepping various spokespeople involved for this kind of scale of incident that is not going to go away overnight? It's going to be an ongoing kind of thing. So, with all your experience in this realm, what what do you think the government could have done to better prepare their spokespeople and empower them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I think it's really, it's a situation that is honestly challenging for staff and issues manager to prepare and empower spokespersons on the Greenbelt issue, whether it's in the media or in the House. And the reason for that is because they're learning the information as it's coming out, right? Those that are involved in the Greenbelt, issues, there's no incentive for them to come forward because they're doing it to protect themselves. So when you're learning information as it's coming out, as reports are being released, you're left with no choice but to be reactive rather than proactive, because you just don't know what you don't know. And that you can see that that's the I'll say the approach, but it wasn't really an approach. It was just kind of forced upon those that were the spokespersons or at the time when all the information came out. They were caught between a rock and a hard place when they're learning about who's involved based on the Integrity Commissioner report. They didn't know who was there. So I think at the very beginning, you can see there was a very reactive approach in terms of the first few weeks that it came up, and they just simply don't know the facts, right? Whether that's the spokesperson or those prepping the spokesperson. The thing that I think has changed over the last few weeks is there's definitely been more of a proactive approach, and I think that happened once they put Paul Calandra in as housing minister. He's seen as someone that is a steady hand, as a man of integrity, and you can see that there's been a change to being more proactive versus reactive, and they're kind of getting, now that the information has come out, or a lot of information, and I still think that there's more to come, they're kind of getting a handle on things and turning around. You're seeing legislation changing and taking a more proactive approach. The one thing, though, that I think that government should be aware of and planning for is there is still a criminal investigation going on. And if we look back at past government criminal investigations, think gas plants or Mike Duffy, charges are laid 2 years later. So just when the media cycle's over, on what's happening now, it's, everyone's reminded again 2 years later. And in this case in Ontario, 2 years later is right before the next election. So what are they doing in order to prepare themselves for what's coming out next? I think that they had a rough 5-6 weeks there with the Integrity Commissioner coming out, kind of paying that catch up, that reactive. We saw, Minister Clark, we saw some staff who also left government, and that was more reactive. We're now in a position where they're taking a more proactive approach, but how are they going to keep that up going forward, knowing that there's more to come?
Yeah, that's a really good point. How do you keep it up and prepare for that? Charles, Noah, you've got a background as a journalist, and you are also chief of staff to the former Minister of Economic Development and Growth at the provincial level. So I imagine you've been watching this story unfold from a few perspectives. What's been your take on how the government has communicated this to the public, and what can they do going forward to prepare for if the results of the criminal investigation are not what they hope for?
Yeah, Anne Marie, it's just a fascinating set of circumstances, and really I share the views of Logan and Colin on this. As a former chief of staff, obviously I was watching the attribution of responsibility, let's put it that way, as it moved over the course of the story. And I thought that was something that was, that frankly, could have been done, to borrow Logan's term, in a more proactive and less reactive way. And I thought that parts of that just didn't pass the public smell test. I mean, the public, as we all know, being communication professionals, are intelligent, and they understand workplaces and how things operate. And so from that perspective, I thought that some of that attribution of responsibility, certainly in respect of the staffers involved, was was a reactive and not a proactive step. Listen, I think the government has its work cut out for it as this story continues, and as, frankly, newly energized political parties chase this story, as well as the media do. Right? We've got the Liberal Party with a new leader. She is going to drive this story very aggressively over the next 2 years up to the next election. So this government, to borrow Logan's ideas around proactivity, has to be on its best game in this environment, because it is going to get very, very tense.
It's a good point. Good point. Well, let's move on to our next topic, which is cybersecurity incidents. So not a month has passed this year, this whole year, without a cybersecurity incident making the headlines. That's just the reality. If you haven't got cybersecurity on your bingo card of crises that's likely are going to happen to to an organization at some point, then you're not doing your job if you're a crisis manager. We've most lately was Toronto Public Library is still trying to recover and won't recover until the new year, they say. We've had Indigo Books and music. There's just been a lot, and there's that vulnerability is just there. So Charles, given that is your line of work now, what do you and your team, you've been sounding this alarm on cybersecurity for preparedness for a really long time at your company. So how do you, it's really not like when this is going to be happening, or if this is going to be happening, it's basically when. So how do you feel? Do you feel like most organizations are prepared for it? Have they got a part of their issue management plan is when the cybersecurity happens? Because it doesn't seem like most companies are aware. They seem to be communicating reactively and stumbling, or not communicating very quickly.
Yeah, I think, Anne Marie, I think that's absolutely right. I think the fact is that most organizations across Canada, and even speaking globally, are just not prepared for cybersecurity attacks, and they're not prepared to communicate after the fact. Listen, this issue is getting worse, not better. The point that you make, that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, applies to every single organization, big and small, from coast to coast. You are, if you own a business, you operate a business, you're responsible for the communications of a business, you're advising executives who are working in businesses or public sector organizations of any kind, you need to have a cybersecurity plan in place, and you need to have a communications plan in place. There's just no two ways about it. These attacks can be devastating. There's a significant proportion of organizations that simply don't survive a serious ransomware attack, for example. And we're seeing, as the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity tells us, the federal government tells us, we're seeing an increase overall in cybersecurity attacks, and we're seeing an increase in the sophistication of cybersecurity attacks. And they can be, just devastating. I mean, to take the two examples that you just noted, Toronto Public Library is still working on returning its systems to normal. It won't be back up until next year. The ransomware attack was in October. Indigo suffered serious financial losses as a result of the cybersecurity attack that impacted it. And we're seeing attacks on other organizations that are critical to our society and our democracy. We had a serious attack against Sick Kids Hospital. We've had serious attacks against governments at all levels. Municipalities are being significantly impacted. We've seen attacks against, organizations like water, wastewater, energy, transmission, distribution, communications of all kinds, logistics, transportation, and the list just is endless. And so it really is a critical part of modern management to have a cybersecurity response plan in place now before the attack happens. And just coming back to the communications piece, communications is a critical part of your breach response plan. You have to know what you are going to tell to which stakeholders in which order. And that needs to be done now, not later. You don't want to be in a position where you're working on this in the middle of the night after you hear from your chief technology officer that this has happened to your organizations. You want those key messages buttoned down right now. Obviously, they can be adjusted for the particular circumstances. You need those key messages buttoned down. You need the phone numbers that you know you're going to call, and you need that in your pocket before you go into an event like this. And just my last point on this, it's becoming clearer and clearer as we get further into this sort of new era of just very prevalent cybersecurity attacks. That timeliness and candor are critical to building back trust in cybersecurity. You have to acknowledge that it's happened right away, just like the public library did, and you have to say what's happened to the greatest extent that you can. Also, I will say, like the public library did, so 2 good steps, but those are critical to building back the trust of your stakeholders.
Just before I move on to Logan, do you have a quick example of an organization in the last few years that did a really good job on communications?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sick Kids Hospital did a really good job. I think that they, and that's a, devastating attack that's impacting the healthcare of children. And it was an attack launched by Lockbit, which is a Russian-based ransomware gang. So again, we're seeing the sort of the international political circumstances coming down and impacting a major organization in Toronto, but they went out immediately. You can imagine the anxiety of their stakeholders, right? The parents of the patients who are waiting for, are involved in this healthcare treatment, but they went out very quickly. They had a very effective breach response plan in place. They had a very effective third-party experts. They did not end up paying the ransom. And eventually, as people know who followed this story, Lockbit ended up apologizing for attacking them because one of their affiliates breached the terms of service. So it became sort of a case study in how to run a breach response plan. But I would point to Sick Kids as having done a really good job.
Okay, great. That's a great example. I remember that now. So Logan, you work with a lot of municipal governments, and depending on the municipality, communications departments can range drastically in staff size and resources. So cybercrime, though, doesn't really discriminate. So how can some of our country's less resourced departments prepare themselves to respond to an event like a cybersecurity incident?
Yeah, I think, and Charles definitely touched on these 2 things. You're not going to necessarily have the resources within your own house, whether that's in your IT team or whether that's on your communication side. Maybe you have a really good IT team and they've dealt with these types of issues in the past, but likely they haven't, and there's many that haven't, right? And same on the communication side. So I think it's really 2 plans that kind of go together, right? It's making sure that you have a plan. It's making sure that you're prepared in case you do get a cyber attack. So that's on the IT side. Hire outside consultants, have them work with your IT team, put a plan together, get an audit, update that plan, identify your vulnerabilities, prepare for the worst, and get that kind of I'll call it the IT plan ready to go. And don't just put it on a shelf and let it collect dust. Make sure that you're getting that out every 6 months, every year, reviewing it, going back, doing a check, making sure your team is updated, prepared. You can even run like scenario training with both your IT teams and your comms teams, and then whoever else kind of needs to be involved. And then while that's going on in terms of the audit and getting that all prepared, you're going to want your communications team to be working very closely with your IT team to develop that comms plan. It's getting those letters drafted already, knowing who they're going to, knowing who to contact, getting the phone numbers, getting the emails, having that stakeholder map of who needs to know what and when in different types of scenarios. And this is, again, I see this all the time. People, make a crisis plan, they put it on a shelf and they don't revisit it until they have a crisis, and the phone number's changed, that person doesn't work here anymore, all that stuff. So these are all things that need to be reviewed regularly, but they go hand in hand. And I think that it's really important, and those that have worked in communications know that sometimes, departments and whether that's IT or others, they can get kind of far ahead on their own planning and then kind of come to comms after. And I think it's really important that everyone's working together because everyone has a role to play. But hire outside consultants if you don't have the inside expertise. Send your people for workshops, webinars, training, on a semi-regular basis. So then when something does happen, you already know who to call because you have your trusted contacts from hiring them to do your audit and your plan. And you know that your staff are as prepared as they possibly could be given the circumstances.
Thank you, Logan. Quickly, Colin, we this question don't have too much time left, but in your experience for reporting these kinds of incidents, what should communications professionals, who are the ones that are going to have to communicate this, the event to the public, what should they keep in mind? What do the public need to know?
Well, I think, I mean, to Charles' point, right, to be, first of all, upfront about exactly what's happening so that the public knows, right? The public has to have trust and confidence in your institution, in the fact that you are doing everything you can to make sure that everything is good to go, right? And as an example, if there's ever any issues with Metrolinx or with the GO transit system, that is something that is obviously going to impact a lot of people. And the first thing people want to know is, they care maybe secondary about what the problem is and primary about when it's going to be resolved. And the moment something like this happens, where it takes down your systems, or it impacts your ability to provide the service that you're looking to provide to people at home, the first thing you need to do is almost set that timer, right? Set a countdown to try to figure out, okay, how long has it been since the event? Because now we need to know what to do 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, so that you're not leaving people hanging, asking the when question. When is things going to be back up and running? When are we going to be back to 100% capacity? And I think as long as people or the companies understand that your primary responsibility is to let people know when you'll get back to 100%, if not when you'll get back to a 50% to 25%, that way you almost immediately dispel the frustration that they're going to have in your service. I would say that people care first about when you're going to be back to 100%, and then secondary about exactly what has happened. But if you want to not undermine the trust and faith that people might have in your institution, especially if you intersect a lot with the public, it's to be as fulsome and open and transparent about what exactly happened. Because, if this is not your fault, you have nothing to lose and everything to gain from being upfront with people. And then at the end of the day, people will know that you're doing everything in your power to make sure that this is a learning opportunity and won't happen again. So, that would be my number one suggestion, though, almost set a timer from the moment it happens, so that you as the CEO or as the corporation is aware of how long it's been down to the second, so that you can keep people abreast of what's happening and how long it'll take to fix it.
Good points. All good points.
Anne Marie, I just want to jump in and just one last point, just to both of these points. The best organizations that are best prepared to deal with this practice their responses. So running exercises, to Logan's point about don't let the plan, gather dust on the shelf. Actually practice it regularly, and communications professionals should definitely be a part of those exercises. So run exercises regularly is an important piece.
Good. That's a very good point. So in keeping with emergency responses this summer, the headlines were clear that Canada is burning. There were wildfires all over the country. I mean, in every corner of the country. We've had wildfires before, but it's creating massive challenges for crisis communications and for communities across Canada. So whether it was protocols weren't followed, information wasn't given, it was wind patterns changing, all kind, climate change is, there's a lot of different explanations for why we have these forest fires. But Logan, from your perspective, after you've read and You've seen all the following and the teachings from the forest fires. With respect to crisis communications and emergency management, what's needed to put these learnings into practice ASAP? So as communicators, we can do a better job when our community's on fire.
Yeah, so I actually have an example of how crisis communicators worked with the emergency management team. So when I was working at the government in Manitoba, and during COVID and the vaccination implementation task force, and we were trying to figure out how to get everybody vaccinated, we needed to provide regular updates to the community. And they needed to be from an operational perspective as well as from a medical perspective. And so what I did is I approached our Deputy Minister of Emergency Management, and I said, you are now the spokesperson. We will give you training, and you are going to go out every Wednesday for a press conference, and you need to be prepared. And what that did was, and it took a couple of weeks, but not that long, was then the emergency management team started thinking about response from a communications perspective and how they're going to communicate that to the public, because he needed to be prepared in order to answer the questions that the media were going to give him every Wednesday. So what we did is we brought the two teams together and created that, this was someone that had never been in front of the media before, and didn't just throw them out there. We gave a lot of training and advice, and we would work hand in hand. But it created the understanding of what the public needs to know and what the types of questions are going to be answered. So then therefore they could prepare the emergency response knowing that they were going to be asked these questions. And so I think that sometimes it gets lost in the big machines of government, particularly like even with forest fires, right? That's usually a provincial response in terms of, it's a combination of provincial federal response, but they don't, they go and they put their, tools into action, and they start, evacuating people or responding to the fires, but they don't necessarily think about like, how are we going to communicate this and who is going to communicate that? So by tying the two together and making sure that they work closely, and providing those updates, and you know what, the public loves to hear from the people that are actually responsible for or in charge of these responses, right? So putting those people out in front of the camera, making them your spokespeople, training them, of course, making sure they're comfortable, but then they start to understand what we as communicators are dealing with, or why we're asking questions, or why we need the answers to certain things. And I think that we saw now, I mean, with the forest fires, there are areas of Canada where it's typical, every year you see a little bit of I'm in Winnipeg, almost every year in northern Manitoba, we always have, some element of a forest fire, and there's a very, comprehensive response to that, and they kind of have it, as a playbook. But what we saw this past summer was a lot of communities that haven't experienced this before, and there wasn't a plan, and they didn't know what to do, and people were scrambling, trying to figure out where to go and what to do. So I think now that we have seen that this can really happen anywhere, these communities, whether that's on the municipal, provincial and federal, because they all have a role to play in the response, they need, similar to the cybersecurity, they need to plan for this, because it could happen again. And it's not much different, and I'm sure they are, after seeing what happened this past summer. I'm sure a lot of provinces, municipalities, the federal government, they have a much more, they're getting ready in case these events do happen again. But the other thing is that we're seeing this in BC, is the amount of money that it costs to respond to these forest fires as well, right? So making sure that the government has set aside that money, in case an event like this does happen again.
Yeah, all good points. I'm going to kind of switch the perspective in this emergency with go to you, Colin, and say, because the way the public hears about during an emergency and many different kinds of emergencies, but these kinds of on the ground emergencies, often the public, even the local communities, are hearing about getting updates, getting information through the media. If it wasn't for the media telling us what's going on, we wouldn't be able to even really know about it. So how do you work with how do you suggest the media work better or more effectively with emergency responders in order to be able to communicate with the public? And then offshoot of that, Charles, I'll go to you to say, how do you then take care of yourself? People that are working right in an emergency like that 24/7. Colin?
In terms of the communications of it, I mean, I think the best example would be the beginning of the pandemic, right? So that, it's a pretty consistent example because unfortunately we all went through those wonderful few months. So at the very beginning of the pandemic, what you saw from the media was this understanding, this inherent understanding that the role that we played was less of a critical aspect or criticism and more of a public service, right? And what we saw from the government was, regardless of whether they had to say anything or not, and understanding that this was an unprecedented situation that merited a response that met the moment. So the government would come out every single day, and regardless of whether they had something to announce or not, put themselves out there to engender trust with people at home and to kind of demonstrate that they are watching and focusing on the situation every step of the way. And so our job in that situation, especially the first early couple of months when everyone was trying to piece the exact same thing together in real time, our job was not necessarily to hold government to account in that moment, and it was more of we need to be the conduit between the people at home and the people who are making the decisions, and ask questions of the people making the decisions that would be on the minds of people at home, right? In terms of how long is this going to last? What is your contingency plan for A, B, and C? How much money are you going to allocate to this? Where is this? But without necessarily asking it in a critical way. And in fact, in those early months, we didn't even use a lot of the official opposition in a lot of our stories because it was so much about providing a public service. So I think in those cases, especially when there's an emergency on the ground, right? When you have in the case of a forest fire that's now jumped from the forest, come across the street and is now threatening neighborhoods or tearing neighborhoods apart, our job there is to first and foremost drop everything else and make sure that we're speaking directly and as clearly to people at home, making sure that you repeat information, every 10 or 15 minutes if you're on a radio service providing like a 24-hour news service as an example, so that people at home who might be tuning in at any given moment can get up to speed as quickly as possible. And then just trying to get as much factual, non-politicized information as possible so you can provide it to people at home. So there is always going to be a place to do the armchair quarterbacking, to look back at a particular event and say, how could the government have done better, learning for the next event? But for that particular event, our job is just to make sure that we're getting information from as many sources as possible, trying to put it in as clear a way as possible for people at home to understand, because there should be an understanding on our part that the information we're providing, the way we're providing it, could be life or death. It could be critical. So there are those times when you'll see the media come together to kind of understand their role in society and the importance that they play. And those mass events are definitely one of those times.
Thank you, Colin. And Charles, just quickly, what are some top things that we can do as communicators or media on the ground during those kinds of events to take care of ourselves?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. I think it's often overlooked, and certainly these events are traumatic. I mean, they are traumatic. They're traumatic for the people who are involved. They're traumatic for the governments that are wrestling with these issues. They're traumatic for the media. They're traumatic for the communicators who are trying address these issues. And I've seen, certainly in the cybersecurity context, I've seen teams really deteriorate quickly under this kind of pressure. Taking breaks is obviously critically important. Cycling staff, where possible, out of the limelight so they can get some rest before they come back, is very important. And supportive, leadership at all levels that understands what the pressure that people who are under, who are communicating around these kinds of events is really, really important.
That's good. This is a good, try and be quick as possible with this one. And I just wanted to say to our audience that if you have a question, I might have time for one. So if you want to put it in the chat, but if this one we can try and do quickly, it's just a question about in Canada, when I was a journalist, and government leaders there and politicians, their personal lives were kind of off limits. It's not been like that in the States for a really long time, but every once in a while it does, their personal lives enter the public realm. There seems to be more media attention to personal lives. There's a Trudeau separation, as the Tory affair. When is something, do you decide something's off limits? And Colin, I'll go to you first for that.
So it is really nuanced. As an example, there's a story in Ontario about the Premier's family stag and doe, right? There is a crossover with government, and there's a crossover with the idea of money going from those who seek to influence to those who could be influenced, and that's why that's a story. It's a really fine line and a really case-by-case basis. I agree, things are changing. For me, I mean, there are family members of politicians who have chosen to not participate in politics, and so their lives should be completely off limits. And to a large degree, if the politician isn't doing something that involves the public, I don't think the public needs to know about it. I don't care who you're dating off to the side. I don't care what kind of a car you're driving. I mean, if it intersects with your office and there is abuse of power, then it's a story. If not, to me, God bless, go live your life.
Thank you. Logan, how do you prepare government leaders and public figures for when journalists, get into the off-limits territory?
Yeah, there's definitely been, a shift, and again, back to Colin's point, it is very nuanced, right? It kind of changes depending on the day or on the topic or on the person, really. So one thing that I always do when kind of faced with a crisis or a reputation management client or situation, or it could, I'll say it could become, and I'm made aware of it, is I immediately start by saying, okay, you have to tell me everything, because if you don't tell me everything, then I cannot help you. Like, you cannot hold back any little detail, like stays here, I'll sign the NDA, but I need to be prepared, because now we don't know what's that line anymore. So, even though, my response might be, okay, that's good to know, just in case, but I don't think that's probably where they're going with the story. But now I know in case they are, right? So I can be prepared for it and be, proactive should that get brought up. I think also, which just with the rise of social media, I also think that has also impacted kind of what's off limits, what's not, because so many people are putting out their lives for everyone to see and tagging, and then someone else is posting and you're screen grabbing. And so that's another question that I ask, okay, what photos, who has photos, who was at the party, did they post photos on their Instagram account, whatever the situation may be, because you want to be able to collect everything and just prepare for the worst should it go, should it cross that kind of off limits line, because we have seen that happening, more and more in Canadian media, and I think that's largely due from, influence from American media, because it doesn't seem like anything's off limits there.
Charles, does it bring up anything for you? What's your thoughts? You've been the public face of an organization before.
Yeah, no, I would just say that especially in terms of these kinds of emergencies that we've been talking about, things like the wildfires, things like the the cybersecurity events, the public trust at stake in the Greenbelt. I think that the appetite of the public for personal issues related to policymakers is relatively limited when the problems are so significant. And certainly when I was advising a minister, we had a situation and had situations where the media was asking tough questions, but they were always based on the matter that affected the public interest. And so I would just, I think that's the important nuance to take, and both Logan and Colin have mentioned that.
Yes. So we're going to try and do a bit of a lightning round. I don't see any questions coming. What is a little, these questions are going to lighten, so you have to keep your answer really quick. But what is the biggest story you anticipate for 2024? I know you have to think, and it could be anything these days, but what's your thoughts? What do you anticipate in your best guess for 2024?
I can start. For me, it's just going to be the continuation.
Oh, sorry, Colin. Yes, sorry, Colin.
No problem. I think it's just going to be the continuation of Israel and Gaza. I don't think we've seen any one event have such ripple effects right across the globe, and it's created a lot of tension and animosity in our communities, and a lot of it is unresolved. So, and I think that's just going to carry forward in 2024.
Yes, good guess. Logan, your thoughts?
Trudeau steps down, triggers a leadership contest for a new Liberal leader and ultimately prime minister.
Oh,
that's you hoping, I think, rather than
Charles.
Listen, we've got a 2024 election in the United States coming up that is going to be a big story, and cybersecurity issues around. There's a wave of elections next year across a number of different democracies, and lots of concerns about misinformation, disinformation, AI, cyber related to those. So I think that's going to be unfortunately a big story.
Good guesses. Good guesses. All right. Well, what's the best headline you haven't read yet, but will hope to come to pass in 2024? That's a bit complicated, but well, you haven't. So it's really one you expect, but you really hope doesn't happen.
Ooh. That is a really tough one.
Anybody can think of an answer for that one? If not, I'll go to my next one.
I'll just say Vivek Ramaswamy becomes president of the United States. I'll put that one out there.
Oh, okay, Charles. I think you have thought something.
No, I'm just saying. So this is something we think is going to happen. We think is going to happen, but we don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with Colin. Trump elected president of the United States is that's all staring us all in the face.
Well, hang on though. From my perspective, I mean, those of us in the journalism world, we like stories, and there are some who are the gift that keeps on giving, and so.
Fair enough.
That's true. That's true. Rob, 4 days meant for a lot of work for reporters. Logan.
I have to agree with Charles. I think that's that'll be, yeah. I think that'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting year, that's for sure.
Okay. And the last lightning round question is, one piece of advice communications professionals need to take away from today to prepare for 2024. That's a really important question. So it's a little more serious. So whoever has an answer for that, go first, please.
I'm happy to jump in. I think it's plan in advance, review your emergency management, your crisis plans, your cybersecurity plans, ensure communications are central to your response. When in doubt, if your organization is small, but you need to be prepared for these things, hire outside support and expertise. And the one thing that I always like to tell people, that even if you are a communications professional, if you are the center or the crisis is happening that impacts your workplace, your colleagues, your livelihood, your reputation, it's really hard to remain calm, cool, and collected. So If you need to hire, other people to come in and bring that kind of that calm and that perspective to help you get through it, help your organization get through it, like, yeah, don't hesitate to do that because it does make a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a really good point. In my first years as in corporate comms, we would put the crisis comms plan into effect maybe once a year. And my last year, it was in effect 5 times, and several times we had 2 different things going at the same time. So you got to really be prepared. Charles, can you think of something?
Yeah, I think, being prepared is key. I mentioned it before, but practice. I think that's really important. A lot of these events, unfortunately, are foreseeable. There will be, unfortunately, another wildfire season. There will be, your organization will be the victim of a cybersecurity incident. So prepare, have your plan, and practice your plan, and engage with the third parties you need, get the support and good objective advice that you need, and bring those folks into your practices, into your exercises, so that everybody knows what each other is going to do. So when the crisis happens, you'll be calm knowing that you've already prepared, and you'll be able to better deal with the eventuality. So practice, practice, practice.
Good points. Colin, can I just, whatever you're going to say, can you add this a little element for communications professionals? Because I think during a crisis, most people are afraid to, or because it's a tense situation, they don't want to actually talk to the media. So how can we also prepare so we're the face and out there in the face? Because I think it's the best way. But
right. So I had 3 things to not forget, right? Don't forget to communicate. I know that sounds really simple, but a lot of times when some people or some entities or governments in particular find themselves in trouble, they immediately clam up because they're doing all this work behind the scenes, trying to figure out, what are we going to say? What are we going to say? What are we going to say? And the problem is that just that the clock keeps ticking by. And the longer it gets from the moment that original question is posed, the more you start to kind of lose ground, because the court of public opinion will take away. So whether it's, off the record communication, on background communication, or on the record communication, just don't forget to pick up the call. If a journalist is calling you, call them and say, we've received your request. We'll get back to you in a few minutes. Or, just for background, here's a couple of things you need to know as we work in a more finalized response, and then, give them the finalized response. Number 2 is, don't forget that sometimes the most simplest questions can lead to your entire undoing. A lot of people think about the complex questions and everything that needs to be answered. And sometimes, as an example, when the Ontario government was giving each family of a child with autism $5,000. The most simplest question I asked was, hey, can you tell me what $5,000 can actually buy? And they didn't have an answer to it, because they just were so focused on, we're giving money. They didn't bother to think about, what could that actually buy? So sometimes the most simplest question can completely, derail everything. And the third thing to not forget, do not forget about the follow-up. So many communications professionals will focus on the statement that they're going to put out there, or they're going to focus on the main thing that they want to talk about. We will have follow-ups, and we might have 3 follow-ups or 10 follow-ups. And some of those follow-ups will get technical, because journalists will come to an interview well-informed, well-armed, with a lot of information, and they will surprise you in terms of what they know and how much research they've done. So there will be follow-ups. And if you forget to prepare for not just the initial question, but the follow-ups that will come along, that is what often will get you in more trouble. Because I can tell you, from what I'm going to put on the 6 o'clock news isn't going to be your prepared statement that you read off paper, unless you're resigning or something and didn't take questions. It's going to be something from the question that I asked you. And oftentimes I will use the question that I asked and the response, because the response has more weight to it or more relevance, depending on what question was asked. So don't forget about that. We're tricky.
We're tricky. And you
and
did
we'll
use it. You used to ask me the best, always unique questions. I'll never forget that. Always where
Yes.
I
I
had to
also
prepare for, oh, I didn't think of that.
I've also been told that I personally have a tell, and a lot of journalists have a tell when they don't believe your BS. Is for me, it's I literally cock my head to the side and I like start squinting my eyebrows because I'm like, I don't believe what you're saying, or what you're saying doesn't make sense. So if you know the journalist enough, you can eventually come to tell what their tells are
I
and
never saw,
anticipate if they think that you're BSing. Just a little, that's your little
never
inside.
saw that ever. Oh, well, this is was a great way to wrap it up because we're just about at 3 o'clock. It seemed to whiz by. But I just really, really, really want to thank our incredible panelists today. And thank you, Colin, for you must have, I don't even know, you could be still at Queen's Park, or you actually live up the street because I think that's what the premier said. So thank you so much for making time to come here. Charles, such a unique perspective. I think if we're not ready for cybersecurity incidents, you're really going to fall behind. And Logan, another different perspective. It was, just wonderful. I think as communications professionals, I know that that's who's our audience today, many of them, that they are really learned and are terrified of now 2024. Thank you very much. But I also want to remind everybody that we will make this video available of the event and shareable, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues as well. So we'll make sure that we do that, and we're going to do this again next year. We do them 4 times a year at Curious Public, and we figure out the different topics. So I hope there isn't again one on Trump. But we may be doing one on Trump. So, and I wanted to take this opportunity to wish everybody a very, very happy holiday. And I hope you have a safe, healthy 2024, and see you soon. Thank you for coming.